slip the surly bonds of earth and dance the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Hi, and welcome to the fourth installment of the Dad Project. Great to see you, and once again, glad to have you back. In this installment, we have Lieutenant J.G. Purvis, having completed training in the S2F-1 in Kingsville, Texas, reporting to Quonset Point, Rhode Island to join VS-32 to fly the Grumman S2F-1 Tracker. First, I need to step back just a bit and begin by talking about carrier qualifications. This is the moment in a Navy student pilot's training where they are set apart from all other military pilots, landing their aircraft on the moving deck of an aircraft carrier moving at flank speed. My understanding of that process was that it was done during the advanced training part of their curriculum. In my dad's day, that would have been in the T-28, or so I thought. So when I asked him about it, he told me that his carrier qualification was not flown in a T-28, but in the S2F, and oddly enough on the same carrier where he had been stuffed in the belly of a TBM on his midi cruise, the Antietam. I was initially pretty sure that he was getting his facts muddled as he lay dying, but I was incorrect. In fact, at the bitter end of his advanced flight training in the T-28 from June 19th through June 28th of 1958, in the span of 8.5 hours, he made 77 field carrier landings, FCLs, possibly at Barron Field in Alabama, named in honor of Lieutenant Louis Theodore Barron, a Navy test pilot and one of the pilots of the flying boat NC-1 during the Navy's transatlantic flight in May of 1919. And, as FCL implies, these landings were made on a very static, unmoving airstrip. In commemoration of that accomplishment, that log page is stamped with a big, blocky black ink, field qualified, and the carrier landing column on that page is empty. By the time my father had his chance to make his arrested landings on the Antietam, the aircraft carrier had been invented and refined over a 40-year period, spanning 3 major wars and with Vietnam on the horizon. Balloon carriers and seaplane carriers would precede the fixed-wing aircraft carrier. It would be on November 14th of 1910 that Eugene Ely would make the first flight from a ship from the anchored USS Birmingham in Hampton Roads, Virginia, and after 5 minutes aloft, landed ashore. He would then be the first pilot to land on an anchored warship, the USS Pennsylvania, on January 18th, 1911 in San Francisco. His landing was arrested by a crude rope and sandbag arresting system that foreshadowed the system carriers use to this day. It would be the British and Japanese that would take the lead on the development of the modern carrier. It was the HMS Hermes that was the first purpose-built carrier laid down in 1918, while it was the Japanese Hosho that would be the first purpose-built carrier to be commissioned in 1922. A slight distinction, and it would be the Hermes that introduced 2 of the most distinctive aspects of the modern carrier profile, the full-length flight deck and the starboard side control tower island. The Hermes would be sunk in 1942, while the Hosho would survive the war as a training vessel to be surrendered and scrapped in 1946. The first American carrier was the USS Langley, CV-1, that began life in 1912 as a Jupiter, Navy Fleet Collier No. 3. In 1920, the Jupiter morphed into the Langley to begin its life as an aircraft carrier, and like many of the first carriers, was either a ship modified from its original purpose or laid down originally as a different type of ship. It would be on the Langley in 1922 that Lieutenant Virgil C. Griffin would be the first American to take off from an aircraft carrier, and soon after, with the Langley underway, that Lieutenant Commander Godfrey de Courcelles Chevalier made the first landing in an Aeromarine 39B. Additionally, the Langley would morph one more time in 1937 to become a seaplane tender, but in her demise, she would find herself loaded with fixed-wing aircraft. Early in the American involvement in the war, February of 1941, the Langley proceeded to Fremantle, West Australia, to pick up 32 P-40s of the Far East Air Force's 13th Pursuit Squadron, along with their pilots and ground crews. They were to make way to Cilacap, Java, to deliver the squadron, but on their way were attacked by 16 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, escorted by 15 A6M Ryson fighters, better known as Zeros. The Langley would be crippled, and her crew would be picked up by several escorting ships. The escorts would fire their guns into the listing Langley and sunk it to avoid its loss to the Japanese. Sadly, over 2/3 of the ship's crew and their squadron members would perish on the ships that had saved them, as they were sunk themselves. Following the end of World War II, it would again be the British that introduced two other innovations that made aircraft carriers that much more effective: the angled deck and the steam catapult. Several launching systems had been used before the steam catapult: a compressed air system, gunpowder, and hydraulics. The hydraulic system being the most prevalent, but with the advent of the larger carriers following World War II that could carry larger aircraft and jets, there was a need for a more powerful system. Initially, the U.S. Navy had been moving forward with a gunpowder charge system, but upon reviewing the British steam system, abandoned the charge system. The steam catapult will get the aircraft aloft and flying, but what about a better landing system? The arresting cables were not an issue, but what the British surmised in the winter of 1944 was that the jet was the future of naval aviation, and with their higher landing speeds and gross weight, the straight deck environment was not ideal. In the early 50s, an angled deck was painted on the HMS Triumph, but as the arresting gear and barriers were still aligned with the center line of the ship, it was only good for touch and goes. It wouldn't be until 1952, when the USS Antietam aligned those systems with a true angled deck, that the advantages of the angled deck were realized. This would lead to the SCB-125 upgrade for 15 of the 24 Essex-class carriers and the SCB-110, 110A upgrade for the 3 Midway-class carriers. In short, these upgrades modified World War II carriers with angled decks, steam catapults, and other systems, which extended their useful lives considerably. So, having made 55 FCLs in the F2F, my dad took off on December 10, 1958, into the sun with temps falling through the 50s, and flew to the angled deck USS Antietam, making way in the Gulf of Mexico, where he made 9 arrested landings. Other than a 9 being noted in his logbook for carrier landings, there is no big black stamp letter celebrating his accomplishment. No matter, he had gone as far as he could in the Naval Air Training Command and was given his orders to proceed to Quonset Point, Rhode Island, in the guise of a carrier qualified commissioned officer, ready for his first squadron assignment. Now, you may be wondering why I went to a bit of detail about the development of the carrier. Well, for one, I find it fascinating. For another, my father's flight career was about to take an odd turn. All my dad's training up to this point was in anticipation of flying off an angled deck carrier. Having been assigned to VS-32, he would be flying off the USS Wasp CVS-18, and the Wasp was one of the Essex-class carriers that had been modified with the angled deck. Having qualified to land on a carrier in training is one thing, but as a newly arrived nugget in VS-32, nugget denoting a naval aviator on their first deployment, he would need to qualify again while flying his aircraft in various real-world situations. So once again, from April 15th through April 24th, 1959, he made 65 FCLs. Then on April 29th, he made 10 arrested landings on the Wasp and something new: 2 catapult launches. Now, in modern Navy carrier operations, 10 traps and 2 cat launches is bad math. But with the boat pointed into the wind and at flank speed, this low and slow, antiquated beast, the S2F, didn't need a cat launch in many configurations to get airborne. Having said that, It would be an S2F that would make the Navy's first steam cat launch from the Hancock CVS-19 in 1954. And then on August 18, 1959, it all changes as the Wasp was heavily damaged when a helicopter engine exploded while being tested in a hangar bay, while the boat was underway 250 miles off the Virginia coast. It would take over 2 hours to control and extinguish the subsequent fire. Ominously, at the time of the accident, the Wasp was carrying nuclear weapons. As the fire was being brought under control, the forward weapons magazines had been flooded, and preparations made to flood the nuclear weapons magazine. Fortunately, this was not necessary, as the temperature in the nuclear storage area didn't rise enough to warrant that action. The day before the fire, my father was flying around the boat and was aboard when the fire broke out. I discovered while looking for information about this part of his life that he had planned to write an article about this experience that day, but that never came to pass. So there is nothing more to say about the fire other than it would send him back in time. At the time of the fire on the Wasp, the other carrier homeported at Quonset Point was the USS Lake Champlain, CVS-39, the last straight-deck carrier in the Navy. She was the only Essex-class ship to receive the SCB-27 conversion, which was a rebuild of the superstructure, flight deck, and other features, and not receive the SCB-125 conversion that would have given her the angled deck. The Champ would be decommissioned in 1966. When a carrier goes on a deployment, it is usually at sea with ports of call mixed in for months at a time. The anti-submarine warfare carriers homeported at Quonset Point at the time of the Wasp fire, however, were on a 2 weeks at sea, 2 weeks in port rotation. A rotation my dad said in a Facebook exchange that was a colossal waste of time and money. Longer deployments would have made more sense, he said. What it did allow for was a quick transition to the Champ, but it also required the pilots to go back in time and channel their World War II brethren to land on a straight deck. One thing the angled deck allowed for was for a pilot to miss the landing wires, a bolter, and go around and give it another try. No such luxury with the straight deck. Whereas the angled deck pilot would apply full power when hitting the deck for a possible bolter and go around, the straight deck pilot hits the deck and cuts power. A bolter on the straight deck meant going into the Davis barrier. It can be seen in this picture taken by my dad on an approach to the Champ. By 1960, nearly all the remaining Essex-class carriers had been designated as anti-submarine carriers, CVS, and new carrier air groups were formed to recognize that fact. These would be called Anti-Submarine Carrier Air Groups, CVSG, and the Champ would sail under the aegis of CVSG 54 while my dad was aboard. My dad has the distinction of being, by his estimation, the first pilot to get 200 straight deck landings on the Champ, over half at night. I have no doubt there was a celebratory sheet cake for that one. To quote another Facebook exchange, I also got to be a CP, check pilot, as the safety rider with guys new to SD landings, including VP guys and blimpies. Had an odd mixture of people transitioning to get the opportunity to enjoy shipboard life. Ergo, I got more than my 200. One ex-VP was scared and scarier. He tried to take a late cut, so I grabbed the yoke and corrected the mess. We ran out the 12-wire. This, by the way, was a night landing, he said. While attached to VS-32, he would attend the operations course at the Anti-Submarine Warfare Tactical School in Norfolk, Virginia. He also served as the personnel officer, public information officer, education officer, assistant administration officer, and the instrument training officer. Downtime in the military is anathema. Like all good things, this would come to an end in January of 1961, after he was accepted to the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School in Patuxent River, Maryland. And we will follow him there. But we will come back to two aspects of these discussions, one being the Stoof, the other being the Champ, in later installments. In any case, thanks for joining me for the fourth installment of the Dad Project. I'm still telling the story I was hoping my father would tell me, and I'm still trying to tell it for him. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.